Heroic rescue team saves careless goat from giant catfish attack. The sky was leaden as the drone streaked across the dam and revealed the image that would spell doom for everyone. In the center of the muddy mirror, a goat spun in circles, aimlessly dragged by invisible currents that pulled it toward the dark funnel near the siphon. The shore teemed with footsteps, sandals and boots dug into the mud. Children pointed with wide eyes, adults tried to gauge the distance intuitively, and the mother goat, in a trance of instinct, stamped its hooves, raising a spray of droplets that returned to the earth like tiny glass beads. The water, previously still, now breathed in gusts, opening in concentric circles that betrayed a massive body scraping the bottom. The drone captured everything in high definition: the brown skin beneath the cloudy film, the shadow with discrete fins, the churning mud, the metallic glint of an ancient hook stuck in a root. Suddenly, a tremor passed through the water like a contracted muscle, and from the opposite side rose a short, brutal jet, which no one wanted to believe was the signature of a giant catfish returning to its hunting grounds. The disoriented goat dove halfway under without meaning to, then emerged in a spasm, its ears flattened in fear, its bleeding reduced to shocked air, and the lifeline separating curiosity from tragedy grew ever thinner. The rescue team emerged along the dirt road with an aluminum boat on a makeshift trailer, ropes wrapped around worn pulleys, circular buoys scratched from use, a rescue belt gleaming in the dim light. Their steps were urgent and their silence practiced. Each one assumed an invisible axis, as if the shore were a chessboard and the animal a cornered king 2 moves away from checkmate. Meanwhile, the community expanded like a tide, drawn by the magnetism of danger. Veteran fishermen occupied strategic points, instinctively mapping the predator's subterranean routes, and a cowboy wielded a long pole to measure the depths of the eroded bank. The drone descended a little, fixed on the goat, and showed, for those who still doubted, what was moving underneath. A broad, almost lazy back describing semicircles of assessment, each turn closer, each curve more confident, as if the pond were a stage and the play had reached the third act with no room for improvisation. The mud bore traces of forgotten dawns, bird feet broken off halfway, hull grooves, net furrows. The air smelled of iron and crushed leaves. The wind, weak, merely brushed back the hair of the onlookers, incapable of influencing the dense drama unfolding at the center. The team launched the first buoy at a calculated distance. It formed a timid parabola and landed discreetly, creating a white ring on the brown dam. A main rope was stretched diagonally, creating a symbolic boundary between the safe zone and the treacherous vortex near the siphon. The boat slid from the trailer into the water with a creak that seemed a warning to discipline itself. Time had become fragile matter. One of the rescuers, wearing a life jacket and flippers, descended waist deep, tested the bottom with short steps, and noticed the subtle suction of sheets of mud on his calf, a sign that the bank pretended to be firm, but gave way with the insistence of a predator. Above, the camera captured the moment the surface changed its language. The ripples lost their random rhythm and began to respond to a moving center. The giant catfish, a presence that had lived for years as a fisherman's fable, took on shape and logic. With each approach, the water swelled without foam, heavy, and the goat spun on the wrong axis, leaving only the reflex to try to keep its head above water. The community held its breath in involuntary synchrony. The rescuers adjusted the boat's position to form a containment triangle. One at the bow with the reaching pole, another at the stern regulating the distance from the main line, a third on the bank, low to the ground, ready to pull the rope with his entire weight. The fisherman's calloused hands held the secondary buoys, as if upholding ancient promises. The subterranean draining of the siphon made a deep, almost organic sound, a sound from a cavern in the chest of the reservoir. The goat lightly collided with the first buoy, missed the nylon's embrace, and was dragged a meter further, and in this small defeat, the tension rose to the point of bordering on the irreparable. The team repositioned the triangle, bringing the end of the lifeline closer to the center, within reach of the animal's involuntary trajectory. A butterfly landed for a second on the top of the rod, then flew away with a flick of its wing, and this tiny detail highlighted the choreographed precision demanded of everyone. The catfish rose higher than usual, displaying a back that traced a semicircle of light shadow. It was an assertion of dominance. The boat responded with a controlled turn, and the rod intercepted the goat's flank in a touch that didn't hurt, only redirected. The larger buoy, anchored diagonally, moved forward like an outstretched arm and finally embraced the trembling body, offering the first solid frontier in many liquid minutes. On the shore, the mother goat retreated half a step and lowered its head in surrender to the moment, a simple gesture that communicated a visceral truth to the entire human circle. Now every second would turn doubt into history. The team tested the pull of the main rope. The boat responded with a brief recoil. The goat rose 2 inches, sank 1, rose 3, and balanced itself. The drone opened the plane so that the rescue plan could be seen as a near diagram. Shore, rope, buoys, boat, animal, rotating shadow. The distant siren of a rural outpost arrived, muffled by the wind, more symbol than resource, reminding everyone that the entire place was watching, consciously or not, the transition from legend to impact. Still, nothing was gained. The predator, sensing the object slipping from its capture radius, altered its pattern. An oblique groove streaked the water, targeting the diagonal between boat and buoy, where a gap in the geometry promised an advantage. The first frontal impact came like a push from below, displacing buoy and goat in a half-meter of chaos. The boat absorbed the shock, the pole gave 2 centimeters, the rope sang, and the crew returned the push with mathematics and calm, pulling without breaking, retreating without giving in, advancing without exposing themselves. The goat, exhausted, surrendered its weight to the buoy, and the buoy, obediently, yielded its weight to the rope. The entire bank moved back a step to create an angle. The shadow disappeared for a moment longer than the previous ones, as if calculating. The collective silence weighed on the shoulders. The drone approached, admirably steady, and fixed its focus on the point where only small bubbles betrayed subterranean life. There, suspended between luck and technique, the goat was no longer just an animal in danger. It had become the axis of a community that, in the end, would learn that the boundary between myth and consequence is merely the sum of ignored signals. And when the water rippled again, everyone knew, without a word, that the climax had only just begun. The day before the chaos began like so many others, with a milky sky casting a soft light over the riverside farm. The pond looked like a polished stone sleeping in the valley, and the upstream breeze carried a sweet scent of cut grass. The herd set off at its usual pace, spreading out along the low slope toward the strip of bright green that bordered the water. There was a tacit agreement between routine and trust. Children gathered buckets, adults checked the fences, fishermen adjusted hooks, and the community's invisible clock marked a time without scares. Within this framework, the curious goat, always a little ahead of the group, stood out with its light step and its habit of chasing patches of shadow on the ground. It seemed like a fragment of energy wanting to prove that the landscape held secrets. The makeshift fence along the backwater, hastily erected after the last rain, was supported by warped stakes and worn wire. In the early morning, high water had pressed against the bank, eating away at the sodden earth from below, until a section gave way almost silently. At dawn, the opening was masked by tufts of grass. The kids sniffed new leaves sprouting closer to the edge and, guided by this promise, escaped the secure design like someone crossing a chalk line on the ground without realizing it meant anything. The mother remained a few meters away, torn between her instinct to watch and the confidence cultivated over months of repeated routes. Nothing seemed urgent. The pond, at that time of day, was usually a mirror, and the ducks scratched the surface with calm movements. The community circulated in small rituals. The foreman mediated demands, mentally noting what needed to be reworked before nightfall. A cowboy was following calf tracks to retrieve rocks. 2 veteran fishermen sank their hands into their gear, selecting hooks and sinkers as if choosing ancient words. The narrator observed the scene with the gaze of someone who had seen floods, false swamps, and overconfidence turn into bad news. Still, the overall picture induced complacency. The reservoir gave back light docilely, as if ensuring that any threat was merely a rumor. The first discordant signs arrived subtly. Smaller flocks of tilapia, which usually formed arabesques near the banks, began to remain halfway to the center. A duck abandoned its usual curve and landed at the other end, where the water ran cooler. A line of bubbles appeared out of nowhere and dissipated without foam, leaving a trail of the faint odor of compressed organic matter. One of the fishermen noticed a difference in the weight of the nets retrieved the previous afternoon, as if something more robust was circulating underneath, displacing schools of fish irregularly. The cowboy, measuring a stretch of bank, felt his rod sink a foot deeper, a sign of invisible tunnels dug by the current beneath the clay. Everything was a small, off-key melody, insufficient, isolated, but cumulative for those who know how to listen. Even with the anomalies, the usual resistance emerged. Recent memory held years without major incidents, and the idea of the giant catfish remained catalogued as local folklore fueled by late afternoon stories. The herd continued grazing near the water because grazing there had always been easier. The children continued their journey to the shed because the path was flat and quick. The foreman stuck to the schedule because the promised rain was late. The makeshift fence was postponed because more glaring repairs needed attention. Normality, through repetition, took on the air of an argument. At the bottom of the pond, where ancient tree roots plunged in thick fingers, the bed showed signs of recent change. There was a clean line in the film of silt, as if a heavy back had brushed the wall, and a sort of oblique trail connected this mark to a darker shadow near the siphon. The narrator recorded the drawing mentally, without fanfare. The cowboy found wet feathers gathered in a small swirl. There was no blood, just the abrupt absence of a body that, under normal conditions, would have left Messier tracks. The combination of these elements reinforced an uncomfortable hypothesis. A large predator had made the bottom its home, waiting for the right opportunity to approach the surface. The curious kid, in this context, became the most exposed variable. Its appetite led it to explore the strip of newly grown grass, stretching its neck further than expected, until its front legs reached a spot of ground that seemed firm but wasn't. The earth gave way a centimeter, recovered, gave way too, settled. The mother approached, instinctively blowing air. The rest of the herd kept pace, trusting a perimeter that had worked so far. From a safe distance, the narrator marked in his mind the dangerous alignment. Loose bank, deep water, wide backwater, short route to the siphon, a local legend with twilight habits. Throughout the day, new microsignals reinforced the discomfort. A net that had been retrieved was torn at an odd angle, different from the antler pattern. A rod forgotten on the bank was found displaced 3 meters below, with friction marks on the handle. The deep sound sometimes heard when the siphon is half-open gained density, as if breathing along with the reservoir. A fisherman filmed a long shadow forming a half-moon under the bridge with his cell phone, but the grainy image and the sun's reflection made the footage unconvincing. Still, to trained eyes, the whole thing formed a map. The afternoon progressed with small decisions that, combined, opened a door. The foreman, pressed for time, postponed reinforcing the fence until the following morning. The cowboy led the herd into the shade a few meters from the water. Judging the temperature justified the benefit. The fishermen extended their fishing until later, hunting the large tilapia that usually venture out at dusk. The narrator mentally calculated the distance between the point where the clay turns to mud and the place where the current creates its first turn, and this line, invisible to the herd, hovered over the scene like a silent warning. In the last patch of light, as the sun casts its copper hue over the surface, the reservoir changed its mood. The wind died, and without external influence, the water opened 2 opposing ripples that met at the backwater, forming an ephemeral X. Shortly after, a school of fish jumped uncoordinatedly, not as a trahira escaping, but as a reaction to something larger. The curious kid, filled with the confidence the entire day had given him, took another step closer to the newly softened edge. The bank held. The mother retreated half a meter and turned to observe the trail they had come from, torn between watching her kid and controlling the herd. As night began to descend, the farm gathered what it always gathers: tools for the shed, animals for the corral, stories for the porch. The pond, in turn, gathered shadows. Beneath the dark film, a presence tested distances with the language of those who live in still water and know the topography of deception. Upstairs, the community fell asleep certain that tomorrow would repeat today. Downstairs, the predator noted that it was not long before proof that certainty has a deadline. Between the two worlds, a worn fence marked the point where routine, without realizing it, had already shattered. The next morning brought a washed-out glow and with it, an inventory that no longer fit into coincidences. Next to the shed, among oil drums and drying ropes, the old buoy appeared with a deep suction mark, as if a huge mouth had tested it in the open. On the hull of the small boat, parallel scratches cut through the paint, not like the scratches of a branch, but like the abrasion of rough leather rubbing against wood. At the edge of the bank, a short-haired ribbon was stuck to a bamboo root, lined with goat tracks that tapered toward a stretch where the shore became mushy. The rescue leader went through each item with the method of piecing together a map, recording angles, depths, distances. A veteran fisherman's cell phone provided the missing link, a shaky video in which a long shadow crossed under the bridge and, at the end, a sudden whirlpool opened in the center with no wind to explain it. The sequence of these findings formed the first solid revelation. The presence at the bottom had ceased to be a legend and had assumed density, weight, and direction. The central object was now evident. The dam itself, with its mud tunnels and siphon as its throat. The goat, escaping the improbable line that once demarcated safety, had become unwitting bait within a perfect ambush architecture. The leader marked on the ground, with steps and stakes, the geometry of the danger, a triangle between bank, backwater, and suction, an approach corridor under the shadow of the bridge, a half-moon turning point near the deep roots. The landscape, seen thus, revealed an organism. The community, however, reacted with predictable denial. Some residents attributed the marks on the hull to hasty transport, the damaged buoy to old mold, the bubbles on the water surface to fermenting matter. The grainy video was treated as recordings from another season, displaced in time, incapable of sustaining new fears. The foreman, swamped with tasks, dismissed the matter as excessive concern for a period of truce in the weather. The younger fishermen, proud of their courage, were skeptical, as if giving in to the predator hypothesis would betray a tradition that prefers evidence to evidence. The leader's proposed creation of a temporary enclosure seemed excessive given the high sun and the tame flock. Isolated, he persisted with the survey. He checked the main rope's elasticity, tested buoys with different weights, repositioned the trailer for faster entry, and rehearsed with a reduced crew, forming a triangle with fine-tuned traction. Simultaneously, he scanned the underwater terrain with a borrowed portable sonar, scanning the central channel until he obtained a denser return near the siphon. The simple equipment provided a crude but sufficient image to pinpoint a stationary mass, larger than any known fish in the reservoir. He noted times of peak activity, comparing reports of bubbles, schooling jumps, and the disappearance of ducks in the late afternoon. With each note, one certainty grew: the attack would not be random, but calculated according to the topography. The villain's mask remained intact in the eyes of most. The reservoir, in the broad hours of midday, seemed harmless, reflecting the reflections of clouds and the tranquil geometry of the fences. Children ran past on the trail, women hung laundry on a line, men checked tires, and the subterranean rumble faded into the choreography of life. The water itself contributed to the disguise, remaining smooth, without foam or arcs, as if incapable of sheltering unannounced volumes. Whatever stirred beneath operated at its own pace, choosing windows of opportunity that escaped the gaze upward. For the incredulous, the absence of spectacle equated to the absence of threat. The threats, however, began to manifest themselves in subtle ways. A net stretched out at dusk was torn diagonally in the morning, its fibers taut, a sign of a blow, not where. N or left at the root appeared, its tip glazed with a film of slime stripped from one side, as if it had served as a barrier against something brushing past. In the corral, the dog guarding the path to the pond, previously indifferent, began barking into the darkness of the water, not as if confronting, but as if preventing approach. The low sound coming from the siphon, previously monotonous, gained variations, a submerged pulse that resembled the measured breathing of a sedimentary creature. The rescue leader organized a discreet watch, with short shifts and little fanfare. At first twilight, they silently observed the surface, noting each change in pattern on their watch. A school of tilapia exploded sideways in an incomplete arc, too small for a surface predator, too large for a trahira. A hollow gourd drifted and was sucked into a nearly invisible funnel, emerging ahead with a new crack. Under the bridge, the crescent pattern appeared more clearly, like a repeating habit. The last recording of the shift, taken by the drone at low altitude, captured a swift back scratching the water without breaking the mirror, a technical gesture that wasn't seeking food, but measuring limits. Still, the proposal to fence the shore that same night met with resistance. Moving livestock, moving fences, interrupting fishing during a calm season. It all sounded too expensive for what many considered an exaggeration. The leader, realizing he wouldn't win by argument, reduced the strategy to the essentials. Keeping the boat towed, ropes coiled and ready to go, buoys rigged with knots, a rod within arm's reach, life jackets hung at a height that wouldn't require searching. On paper, he wrote a sentence that would never be spoken to anyone. When the opportunity arises, the answer must arrive before the next turn of the backwater. On the morning of the incident, the sum of the evidence formed an inescapable outline. The goat, restless by habit, found the same corridor of grass that the rain had fertilized along the riverbank. The makeshift fence, delayed for hours and excuses, remained fragile at the exact point where the earth feigned solidity. The pond, a silent accomplice, offered the polished surface that invited careless steps. The predator, patient and geometric, positioned itself out of sight from above, within the blind spot between bridge and siphon. The community, driven by ancient routines, validated the scene with its presence. And the leader, alone in his complete understanding of the game, saw the moment when the story ceased to be a hypothesis and became inevitable. There was no announcement, only a shift of air, an elongated shadow, a circle of bubbles, and the beginning of a drag that would make all denial an impossible luxury. After the initial shock, the team reorganized the terrain with the precision of someone who transforms instinct into method. The leader traced a functional map of the reservoir in the mud, marking depths with painted stakes and indicating, with strips of red tape, the invisible spaces where the predator usually roamed. The boat returned to the water only to calibrate the engines and approach angles, while the ropes were knotted every 2 meters, ensuring progressive traction. The drone, once a messenger of fear, became a time ruler. It flew overhead in figure-8 trajectories, with virtual markers that allowed for comparison of surface movements with the previous day's patterns. Along the edges, small visual bait buoys were distributed as current markers, not to attract, but to reveal the direction of a body moving without revealing itself. The narrator, attentive to the general rhythm, transformed the shore into a war room without the community realizing the name of what he was seeing. With the circuit in place, the first outside allies arrived, carrying a new vocabulary of caution. Technicians from an animal protection organization brought simple radio transmitters, narrow-beam flashlights, a padded restraint hook, and a first aid kit for quadrupeds, as well as protocol sheets for incidents in slow-moving bodies of water. A field biologist brought a portable, higher-definition sonar, capable of drawing volumes on the riverbed with sharper lines than the improvised equipment of the day before. A rural civil defense agent parked an old patrol car at the entrance to the small road and created a symbolic perimeter with cones and zebra tape, not for the effectiveness of the barrier, but to ensure the entire area understood that a process was underway. Technical language began to infiltrate the simple tasks, giving those present the sense that uncertainty was giving way to a plan. With more trained eyes, the water yielded secrets. The sonar retraced the bottom like a blueprint, revealing a main channel that ran from the foot of the bridge to the siphon and 2 pockets of consolidated silt beneath ancient roots. In one of these pockets, a mobile slick remained stationary for long minutes, moving only to complete half-moons at a constant distance from the backwater. The randomly scattered visual bait buoys formed trails when touched by internal currents, until at dusk, 3 of them simultaneously drew converging arcs toward the same blind spot. Overhead, the drone recorded this convergence in a wide shot and, in a later cutaway, offered the clear detail of a brown back that didn't break the surface but undulated beneath it like submerged muscle. The mask began to crack when the reservoir displayed a gesture that left no room for metaphor. Near dusk, the water surface swelled without wind, and a large tilapia was ripped out in a vertical column, leaving a halo of suspended mud that fell like liquid dust. The gesture was seen by incredulous fishermen, by round-eyed children, by adults who preferred prosaic explanations, and for all, it became evidence. The legend changed departments and settled once and for all in the realm of reality. Still, routine insisted on restoring comfort, and in this dual movement, surveillance had to become more steadfast. The biologist ordered the entire herd to be removed beyond the line of dry paths, and the agent improvised a list of actions, prioritizing containment as night fell. Midway through the choreography, the major twist slipped into the story like weeds under a crop. A cowboy, who had sworn the day before to keep his cattle away from the edge, dug a side passage on his own to shorten the walk from the pasture to the corral. He wanted to save steps to save time and thought the red ribbons were an exaggerated zeal. The newly opened corridor led exactly where the clay turned to thick mud, on the same diagonal where the sonar had located the parked patch. The seemingly small gesture reconfigured the board in seconds. The curious goat, already recovered from its initial shock, sniffed out the new path like someone rediscovering a familiar trail and, in a few steps, retraced the route the team had tried to block with maps and ropes. The threat escalated without warning. From the first hull to touch the wet bank, the predator altered its wading pattern and advanced. The visual bait buoys vibrated in sequence, forming a zigzag that marked the movement of a heavy body precisely cutting the path between the bridge and the backwater. The drone, locked in continuous focus, lost depth and gained urgency. The boat, now in the water, repositioned itself with a bow turn to create a containment triangle that would block a direct line between the animal and the siphon. The leader pulled the main rope, and the external allies distributed themselves at the previously marked points, transforming notes into a physical presence. The shore felt the weight of the moment and reduced the noise to a vital minimum. From then on, each element of the plan responded with the economy of someone avoiding collapse by millimeters. The containment hook, until then saved as a last resort, was positioned not to capture, but to prevent the main buoy from slipping off the goat's side at the first push. The biologist, kneeling on the bank, read the sonar as if it were a terrain electrocardiogram, pointing with his finger at the peaks that betrayed the attacks from below. The civil defense agent held the zebra tape against the non-existent wind as if its invisible rigidity could discipline the surroundings. The light dipped rapidly, and narrow-beam flashlights cut out white patches in the water, useful only for steadying the spirit. The cowboy's mistake, calculated as a shortcut, emerged with the weight of involuntary betrayal. His improvised passage had collapsed the social barrier holding back the herd, and part of the community, trying to help, occupied the wrong bank, creating shadows and noise in the very corridor of approach. The team had to add a layer of personnel management to the script, moving arms, asking for space with gestures, redesigning the traction curve to compensate for the presence of bodies and the risk of falling. Time, which had been elastic in rehearsals, stiffened. The predator reduced the distance to the large buoy, and the water formed a shallow dome that announced the frontal push. At the apex of the climb, the evidence turned into action. The boat backed off 20 centimeters, enough to change the angle of the main rope and transform a dragline into a lifting plane. The buoy embraced the goat by the second rib, anchored by a knot that wouldn't give way. The containment triangle closed by half a degree, pushing the animal out of the ideal siphon radius. The sonar, previously a map of patience, exploded in short, dense lines, a sign of acceleration at the bottom. The catfish's first touch hit the buoy's ballast, but encountered a network of forces that yielded without breaking and returned thrust without breaking. The bank responded with a single orchestrated step back, and this minimal retreat was enough for the diagonal to become a ladder. When the goat emerged a hand's breadth beyond their comfort level, the community, until then divided between skepticism and dread, saw without filter the logic that country and legend had masked. The villain had form, rhythm, territory. The rescue had method, limit, cost. Between one and the other, the distance was measured in tight knots, inches of bow, meters of ribbon, and the sudden awareness that any carelessness could rearrange the entire landscape. At the edge of night, with a triangle held up by tense arms and the boat vibrating like a low guitar string, the chapter ended without relief, for partial victory still depended on one more turn of the backwater and one final correct decision. The plan was complete, the allies had arrived, the mask had given way, the betrayal had been contained, but the water, which forgives no haste, still demanded the precision of one who knows that the climax is not a single gesture, but the disciplined sum of all previous gestures. The climax settled in like a thunderless storm, dense and inevitable. The shore became an amphitheater, the pond became an arena, and each person took their place like a cog in a sensitive mechanism. The containment triangle, adjusted by successive millimeters, kept the goat within the narrow radius between risk and salvation. The water surface breathed in contained bubbles, betraying the approach of a heavy, patient body, trained by nature itself to overcome through geometry. The boat, with its engine idling, vibrated a deep rumble that functioned less like brute force and more like a metronome, marking the time of the collective effort. The drone, high enough not to disturb, low enough to register, rode an invisible trail in the air that, seen later, would prove the legend had shape, mass, and routine. On the shore, the mother goat maintained a vigil circle around the void that separates fear from surrender. Her body trembled, but steadied the herd in an ancient discipline. As the water vaulted into a low curve, The first real push rose from below like a shadow elevator. The main buoy sank half a length, the rope sang a semitone, the boat gave a span and gave back too. The leader, his feet dug into the mud, determined with his own body weight the angle needed to transform the pull into leverage. The restraining hook, applied at just the right moment, prevented the snare from slipping off the goat's flank. The sonar burst into short bursts, signaling successive attacks under the buoy line. The crowd, reduced to the bare essentials of breathing, allowed silence to become a tool. No shouts, no extra arms on the wrong side, no extra shadows in the predator's corridor. The catfish surfaced enough for its back to cut the surface in an irregular arc, revealing rough skin speckled with mud, firm fins, the weight of an ancient river trapped in a recent reservoir. In that instant, the mask fell completely. There was no more doubt, no dispute over versions, no shelter in comfort. The predator existed, measured more than any local memory could have imagined, occupied the bottom with the authority of those who survive quietly. Catharsis came without fireworks, made of suppressed tears, clenched fists and flexed knees, a collective body leaning in the same direction. The drone captured the scene that, in the future, would be repeated on small screens with astonishment, pride, and learning. The boat retreated another 20 centimeters, and this minimal retreat converted the drag into a lift. The secondary buoys, kept at the vanishing points, acted as invisible steps, offering the goat a sequence of supports that removed it, inch by inch, from the capture radius. The civil defense agent, with bureaucratic precision, stabilized the zebra tape to push the human mass back a step as the bank gave way under 2 pairs of boots. The biologist, kneeling, read the sonar movement and signaled with an open palm when the mass at the bottom lost momentum. In these breathings, the team applied force en masse, combining muscle and technique. The water, displeased, returned the excess in small, muddy explosions, as if the reservoir protested the loss of its own equilibrium. The second shock came slanted, aiming diagonally between the bow and buoy. The rope twisted a quarter turn, but the stop knot prevented it from unraveling. The exhausted goat surrendered to the rescue plan and, by giving up its weight, let human engineering take over. The entire bank responded with a coordinated step back, making room for the boat's final movement, which turned its stern enough to convert the diagonal into a ramp. The buoy then rose above chest level, and the small, slippery, trembling body overcame the edge as if borne from mud onto dry land. The silent chorus that had compressed the collective throat dissolved in a burst of relief. Shoulders slumped, hands released, knees gave way. In the aftermath of the impact, the landscape reorganized like a city after heavy rain. The team moved the goat to dry ground, checking its limbs, breathing, superficial cuts, and hypothermia. The mother approached in a respectful circle, re-establishing the bond the water had nearly severed. The agent noted the time, duration, and positions, converting memory into record. The biologist walked the shore with a clinical eye, marking on the informal map the areas that would require reinforcement. The drone slowly ascended, enlarging the picture so the community could see the whole. Red ribbons, cones, buoys, a boat, ropes, knots, boot prints, herd trails, exposed roots, churned mud, and in the center, a dark void that still breathed the rhythm of what lay below. The consequences began before the full applause. The foreman admitted the fence's failure and immediately ordered repairs with reinforced mesh, deeper posts, and new staples. The cowboy who had opened the shortcut replaced stakes and tape with his own hands, accepting the symbolic burden of undoing the public error. The veteran fisherman, with the narrator's help, drafted a protocol for sighting and behavior, naming gestures that had previously existed only in intuition. The children were kept away by a human circle that conveyed care without panic. The farm, in a rare consensus, allocated part of the next sale for warning signs and a short practical course on water containment, open to neighbors. The herd, resettled away from the edge, rediscovered the calm pattern the morning usually offered. The community, reflecting, understood the cost of denying the signs. In isolation, bubbles, feathers, torn nets, and hoof prints seemed like noise. Together, they were a script of what happened. The dam taught us that its surface is a mask and that truth lies in the hidden terrain. The rescue proved that courage without method is bravado and that method without community is insufficient. The predator remained where it always was, and this permanence, far from fueling fury, instilled respect. The error found redress, not with noisy punishment, but with consecutive work, one stake at a time, one knot at a time, one agreement at a time. Finally, as the sun tilted its light and the mud began to dry, the goat walked with still uncertain steps among the other goats, accepting licks, bumps, and smells. The drone's camera, now high, captured the scene as a visual finale. The animal safe far from the water, the red ribbon marking a new line, the boat bowing toward land, the shadow of the short bridge over the backwater, the discreet siphon silent. The narrator, deep within, settled on a simple phrase that didn't need to be said to serve as a closing. Nature doesn't forgive carelessness, but rewards those who learn. Between myth and consequence, the truth appeared where it always was, demanding open eyes and ready hands. And as night gathered the valley, the community, lighter and more attentive, kept within themselves the useful memory of that day when technique, patience, and respect stitched a small life back into the greater fabric of the place.